As Christians and Christian leaders, we have to deal with a lot of issues. One I want to talk to you about this morning, see if I can give a biblical perspective, is the issue of the war on terror. As you're aware, there is a genocide going in the Middle East. 5 years ago, there were 2 million Christians living in Syria. Today, there's 400,000. There's been a slaughter of massive proportions. There are actually 120,000 Christians right now who are on the verge of imminent death in Syria. We're working with some groups there now. We've been able to get in Europe 6 nations to be willing to accept Christian refugees. Right now in America, the State Department still will not let Christian folks seeking asylum come in here. We let folks from all over the nations, entire Somali communities, about 700,000 Muslims a year come here. But at this point, we can't get the State Department to accept these that are being slaughtered, the Christian slaughtered. So we're being able to move families out of Syria, moving them into Germany, moving them into Great Britain, moving them into Mexico, other nations that will accept them. But let me just give you a background of the war on terror. We're very familiar with what it is. It's been in the news, particularly since 9/11 for us as Americans. But there's a lot more to it than that. So let me take you backwards to a spiritual view of the war on terror, because this is not the first rodeo that we've had in this regard. If you go back to a statement made by President Woodrow Wilson, he says, "The nation which does not remember what it was yesterday does not know what it is today, nor what it's trying to do." He said, we're trying to do a futile thing if we don't know where we've come from or what we've been about. Now, in this particular regard, I want to take you back to the founding era, to the founding fathers, because at that time, we had an interesting conflict, a conflict that lasted for 32 years. We fought Muslims. It was America versus Muslim terrorists. It was known as the Barbary Powers War, and it began at the end of the American Revolution and continued through 4 presidents. So for 4 presidencies, probably their number one foreign affairs issue was fighting Muslim terrorists. So this is not a new thing that we've had in America. Let me take you back to how this began. At that point in time, in the same region of the world where we have so much of the conflict going today, the same areas that were conflict, we had 5 nations that were attacking Americans. Those 5 Muslim nations, you see here, there was Turkey, Morocco, Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli. Those were the nations. Today, Tripoli is a city in Libya, but back then it was a complete nation. As a matter of fact, here's a 1736 map that shows the Muslim nations in northern Africa at the time. And so here's Tripoli right here, an entire nation. So these 5 nations were attacking 9 nations that they called Christian nations. They were attacking the United States, they were attacking Great Britain, they were attacking France, they were attacking Holland, they were attacking Sweden. They said, we're Muslims, you're Christians, we're coming after you. So these are the 5 nations that began attacking Americans. And what happened was, as American ships would sail anywhere to the Mediterranean, we had lots of trading partners. We had trading partners with Russia. We had great relations with Russia at the time. There were just a lot of places that we went with our commercial ships. And wherever we went in that Mediterranean region, we were being attacked. If there was an American flag, they were going after the Americans. Now, initially, they were just killing the Americans on the ships. But then they found out, we don't need to kill them. If we'll take and enslave them, we can sell them for ransom. And so they began to sell officers and captains and sailors at a fixed amount, and that's how they funded the war on terror for a number of years, is they would just capture Americans. And under international law, you're supposed to be able to move freely in those waters, but the same kind of, like the Somali pirates do today, they capture them, they sell them back for ransom, and gives them money to be able to finance their terrorist operations. So it's exactly what it was going at that point in time. And as that was going, when we finished the American Revolution in 1783, in 1784, Congress said, now we've got to turn our attention to the Muslim attacks that we have going. In 1784, Congress dispatched 3 diplomats to go try to negotiate with those 5 different nations. The 3 diplomats they sent to negotiate with those 5 Muslim nations were Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Ben Franklin. They're the first negotiators with Muslim terrorists in American history, and that was in 1784. As they got there, so much of the negotiations happened in London, considered to be a neutral site. So in London, after actually about 2 years, Ben Franklin was sent off to another nation to try to work with them, and Adams and Jefferson continued in London. And after about 2 years of negotiating with these Muslim leaders, Jefferson and Adams felt comfortable enough with them to ask them a very simple question. The question they asked is recorded in their correspondence. It was sent back to the State Department. It's in the State Department today. You find it on the State Department website. But the question that Adams and Jefferson asked us is very simple. We don't understand. Why the unprovoked attacks? We have never done anything to you ever. we've always had great relations. We attacked you. No, why are you attacking us? And they wrote the answer down and sent it to the State Department. Here's the answer that they were given. It says, the ambassador answered us that it was founded in the laws of their prophet Muhammad, that it was written in their Quran that all nations who should not have acknowledged their authority were sinners, that it was their right and duty to make war upon them wherever they could be found and to make slaves of all they could take as prisoners, and that every Muslim who should be slain in battle was sure to go to paradise. Adams and Jefferson said, we found out this was theological. This didn't have anything to do with whether we provoked them or not. It didn't have anything to do with whether they liked us or not. This is their theology. Their theology is, this is the way you get to heaven. So they attacked us as a theological tenet and expression of their faith. That was a new revelation for Americans at the time. So what happened as a result was, in that period of time, Muslims were so attacking that they took a total of 1.25 million slaves from those 9 nations that they were attacking. They were using that to ransom back, and that's how they financed their operations. They had larger and larger ships. Our commercial ships would sail in the Mediterranean, usually with 3 cannons on the commercial ship. You could go in with a cannon that you could use to make noise if you're in a fog and shoot off your cannons with powder, etc. So most commercial ships had cannons. These guys were building ships that had 64 cannons. So when a 64 cannon ship bears down on your ship, you give up really easily, which is how they were capturing so many, because commercial shipping was not armed for battle. So in that period of time, you had all these prisoners being taken. Congress then dispatched another diplomat to deal with some of the 5 nations, because we got 3 dealing. Oops. Now let's put another person over there to deal with this. So William Eaton went over there, and as he was dealing with his Muslim nation, this is what he wrote back to the State Department. He says, the Muslims believe that the Americans are a very feeble sect of Christians. They're one of the weakest of the 9 nations. He said, the maxim of Muslim states is that the Christians who would be on good terms with them must fight well or pay well. So that's, at that point, your foreign policy is you either have to fight really well, and at that point Great Britain did and France did, the other nations didn't, or you have to pay very well. So what we got into was the paying very well. The pay well, what we would do is, because we did not have a military, we would say, okay, we will give you $1 million for this year. We will build you 3 cruisers and 2 frigates if you'll leave us alone. And so every year or 2 we had to negotiate treaties with those 5 nations. We negotiated a number of treaties. Again, they're online at the State Department. But this is what we were having to do. Now, when George Washington becomes president in 1789, the foreign issue that he has to deal with is that of the Muslim terrorists. And so the policy at that time, you have to fight well or pay well. Now, fighting well we couldn't do, because the Founding Fathers specifically wrote the Constitution in 1787 so that there would be no standing army in America. They did not want a permanent military. That's why every 2 years in Congress we have to do what's called the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. If we do not fund the military every 2 years, the military goes away. Unlike entitlement programs, it does not exist more than 2 years at a time. So every 2 years, how many battleships we're going to fund, how many aircraft carriers, how many divisions of troops, how many helicopters, every 2 years. The Founding Fathers did not want a standing military, because the belief was a standing military can be dangerous to the liberties of the people. If we ever get attacked again, we'll all do what we did last time. We'll go home and grab that squirrel gun off the mantelpiece of the fireplace, and we'll go take care of whoever attacks us. So we had no stand, but now we find that we're being attacked overseas, and we had not thought about attacks from overseas. We thought about attacks on America, which is what the American Revolution was. So if you can't fight well, then the option with no American military is that you have to pay well. So we started paying extensively throughout those early years. As a matter of fact, you'll find that by the time we get to 1795, 16% of the entire federal budget is being spent on money being paid to Muslim terrorists. That is the biggest single item in the budget, and it would be today if we were still in that situation. 16% of the federal budget spent on that issue. We continued that for a number of years, and then in 1795, Washington said, I've had enough. He said, would to heaven we had a navy able to reform those enemies to mankind and to crush them into non-existence. And by the way, we did not have a navy then, because that's part of a standing military. We had an 8-ship navy in the American Revolution. It was very much privateers. It was private ships that we would build and hire, and would go out. So he said, we need a navy. We got to be able to defend our people overseas. We've got to have a navy. He says to be prepared for war is one of the most effectual means of preserving peace. And that's always been national policy. If I'm standing back there in the corner with a baseball bat in one hand and a pistol in the other, you're not likely to attack me. I mean, it's just the way that it is. And that's the way we always believe nationally. It was a strong defense makes a peaceful nation. And that was articulated by Washington and having to deal with Muslim terrorists back in 1795. So in 1795, he asked Congress, please appropriate money to build a Navy. We need to have a Navy. Now, this is at the end of his administration, but his Secretary of State is Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson said it very well. He said, the persons and property of our citizens are entitled to the protection of our government in all places where they may lawfully go. We'd always thought about protecting Americans in America. We'd never had to think about protecting Americans outside of America until this arose in Washington's administration. So 1795, they make that request to Congress. Congress granted the money, appropriated money for the Navy. And so we have the first Navy that's appropriated by Congress in 1795, and they begin constructing that Navy. In 1796, George Washington retires after 2 terms, and in 1797, John Adams becomes president. When John Adams became president, he very vigorously pursued building the U.S. Navy, which is why to this day John Adams is called the father of the U.S. Navy. Now, John Adams now has a Navy at his disposal. We can end this and be done with it. And yet he would not send the Navy to take care of the terrorists. Why? Because he explained, and remember, since 1784, way back in 1784, he started having to negotiate with the terrorists. He said, I know these people. If we get involved in a conflict, it's going to last decades. He said, I don't think the American people have the stomach to do what it takes to win a war against Muslim terrorists. So he decided we would continue to pay. So rather than fight, we did pay. And so by the time that Thomas Jefferson becomes president in 1801, at that point in time, 20% of the federal budget is now being spent on paying. It is at that point in time that Thomas Jefferson says, no, we're not doing this anymore. He announced, he says, I was very unwilling that we should acquiesce in the humiliation of paying any tribute, which is what we call the payments. I very early thought it would be best to effect peace through the medium of war. So he announced to those 5 nations, we're not paying you anything anymore. The extortion stops. We're not going to give you a cent. That is when they officially declared war on the United States. Tripoli first. That is the first declared war after the American Revolution, was Muslims declaring war on the United States because we would not pay them that tribute tax that they said is due from all infidels, all non-believers, which is, by the way, one of the things that has happened in Syria to keep up with the persecution there. You've seen perhaps or heard some of the beheadings that have gone on. You probably have not seen much of the rest of what's going on. ISIS goes into towns, and the forward scouts of ISIS will mark, they'll find out if Christians there, and they will mark a symbol on the outside. It looks like a question mark, but that means Nazarene. This is where one of the Nazarenes lives. And so as the bigger body of ISIS comes in, they will go to those houses that are thus marked, and they will take the people out. What they very often do is they will begin with the father, they'll begin with the children, and they will impale the children on a pole. Then when the father steps in, they will kill the father, and as the mother reaches out to hug her children that are dying, they will chop off her arms and she bleeds to death. And so there are stakes all over Syria where they are being impaled. And so that is what's going on at this part. But what is the reports coming out of the Christians there is very disconcerting to ISIS, in that given a choice of die on a pole or renounce your faith, and they're not renouncing their faith. And so Christians by the tens of thousands are being slaughtered by their own choice because they will not renounce their faith. So it's disconcerted ISIS, and so what ISIS is doing now is putting the tribute tax on. Well, we'll let you live if you'll just pay us the tax. And that is part of their faith, is that you have to show you're submitted to us. Well, Jefferson said, we're not doing that. We're not going to pay that tax anymore, and that's why there was officially a war declared against the United States, first by Tripoli and other nations as well. So at that point, Jefferson takes his brand new Navy. He takes Eaton, who had been a diplomat, who's now a general. He was a general, and he sends General Eaton over with the Navy. So you've got the Marines. He's leading the Marines on this new Navy, and he also sends Commodore Edward Preble over. So we send 2 military groups over to take care of this problem we have in the Middle East. They arrive, and General Eaton leads the forces. Actually, this is the book about what he did over there in Tripoli, and it's interesting. I want to talk about Tripoli for just a moment, because this whole aspect of Tripoli and where it is, when he went over there to take care of all the Muslims that were attacking Americans across here, Tripoli was the center of action. They're the one nation that did not back down. Turkey backed down quickly. Tunis and Morocco backed down quickly. Tripoli did not back down. And so Tripoli wants to fight, and it's from this fight that lasted for 5 years, American Marines on the ground for 5 years, is where we get the Marine Corps hymn. If you know, from the halls of Montezuma, the Marine Corps flag, halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, that's what it was. It's right there. The halls of Montezuma to when we had to fight terrorists back at the beginning. So that's the Marine Corps hymn, and that's what it refers to. Within the framework of the shores of Tripoli, all the battle that went on there, I want to talk about Tripoli for a moment, because a couple of weeks ago, Ben Carson made a comment. He was asked, would you have a Muslim as a president? And he answered wrong, and then people tore him up. The Cincinnati newspaper said, oh, he thinks it's a Christian nation. Doesn't he know the Treaty of Tripoli? And the Treaty of Tripoli is what gets pulled out on a regular basis. Now, look what Eaton said. This is the commander of the Christian and other forces that marched from Egypt to the desert of Barca to the Regency of Tripoli, the leader of Tripoli. We're going after Tripoli. And they said, don't you know that we have the Treaty of Tripoli? Now, the Treaty of Tripoli was one of about 8 treaties that we negotiated with these nations over a period of about 20 years. The Treaty of Tripoli that they talk about is 1797. It was actually negotiated in 1796. It was brought back for ratification in the United States through the Senate in 1797 when John Adams was president. And in the beginning of the Treaty of Tripoli, and by the way, Alan Combs is the one who loves to bring this out. I had a 1-hour debate with Alan Combs over the Treaty of Tripoli, and it's about a 1-minute debate. It was really a ridiculous program because you can solve this thing in about 1 minute. The Treaty of Tripoli, the first 15 words says, the government of the United States is in no sense founded on the Christian religion. Alan Combs says, end of story, that's it. We're not a Christian nation. Now, I say, well, if we're not a Christian nation, then why do we have more than 300 court cases that say we are? Why did Thomas Jefferson say we were a Christian nation? Why did John Adams say? Well, see, the problem we have today is we don't know how to define Christian nation. We've let the left progressives define Christian nation to mean something that's coercive, something that it was in Europe, that if you're not a Christian, you don't get civil rights, you can't vote. That's not what a Christian nation is, never has been. There's more than 300 court cases that declare us a Christian nation, including 4 U.S. Supreme Court cases that say we're a Christian nation, including a unanimous decision by the U.S. Supreme Court that said we're a Christian nation, in which they spent 16 pages explaining why we're a Christian nation. See, we don't know the historical definition. We get the definition that the critics throw at us today. So they say, that proves right there, we're not a Christian nation. This is the most disingenuous thing out there, because this is Article 11 of the 1797 Treaty of Tripoli. 15 words. You just see those 15 words? The problem is there's no period there. The problem is the sentence is 83 words long. They took a phrase in the middle of the sentence. What the Treaty of Tripoli says, and this is back when we were paying tribute, we hadn't sent the military in yet. The Treaty of Tripoli says the government of the United States is in no sense bound on the Christian religion as it has in itself no character of enmity against the laws, religion, tranquility, Muslim. We're not the Christian nations you dealt with in Europe. We're not the ones who did the Inquisition. We're not the ones who killed you and put you on the rack. We're not the ones who did. We don't have any hatred of Muslims. That's not our Christian religion. That's what you had in Europe. That's what you had for 1,000 years in the Dark Ages. That's not us. We're not a Christian nation in the sense of what you're used to in Europe. So in every treaty that we did, we would always say, we're Christians, you're Muslims, understand, we don't hate you because you're Muslims now. Because you're terrorists, we'll fight you, but we don't hate you because we don't hate religions. That's not what kind of Christianity we have. And so that's what the Treaty of Tripoli is. And when you read the entire 83 words in Article 11, it is a no-brainer. And by the way, if you really want to have fun, this is what the left likes to use to say that we're not a Christian nation. According to the U.S. State Department, there is no Article 11 in the actual Treaty of Tripoli. The clause doesn't even exist. But even if it did, that's what it said. And it existed, it's newspapers that printed it. This is what they printed. But when you read the actual handwritten treaty, it is not in the treaty. The treaty is negotiated and signed at that time over in Europe. It does not have Article 11. Newspapers had it afterwards back in America in 1797. And this is what the newspapers had as Article 11, but it's not even actually in the treaty. So even if it were in the treaty, it still doesn't mean we're not a Christian nation. It means we're not one of the European Christian nations. And that's a big distinction to make. Daniel Webster, the defender of the Constitution, said it this way. He says, American Christianity, that's a Christianity in which the sword and the burning stake are unknown. We don't burn people with the stake here. We don't impale them. He said, general tolerant Christianity is the law of the land. That's a lot of land. We are a Christian nation, but we're not a European Christian nation. We're an American Christian nation. We got back from the Reformation and took the Word of God and started living by the Word of God. In European Christianity, they didn't even know what the Word of God meant. That's why we had the Reformation, to get back to God's Word. You continue the same. You have people like John Jay, the original Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. He, by the way, is the president of the American Bible Society. He says American Christianity was enlightened. You have John Adams, who says American Christianity is rational. John Quincy Adams says American Christianity is civilized. We're not like Europe. We don't kill people because they're not of our faith. We don't use coercion. So here in America, we're completely different. That's why Thomas Jefferson said the comparison between our governments and those with Europe are like a comparison of heaven and hell. Exactly. It's not even close. So that's what we believe, and that's what the Treaty of Tripoli is all about. So Ben Carson got beat up for making that comment, and he got beat up for people who clearly have no idea of history, have no idea of what the documents say, have no idea of the historical background. So going back to General Eaton here, it's interesting that the Treaty of Tripoli, which is what they beat up for, it says here that it's the Christian and other forces. Christian. If we're not Christian, then what's that description of? I mean, go back to the very thing that causes the controversy, and there it is. So William Eaton kept a diary of all these 5 years that they went across fighting Muslims, and for the first few years we were trying to convince these guys, we're not your enemies, we're not here to fight you, we don't like terrorism, we're going to put a stop to that. And this is one of the early entries in Diary, April 8th. We find it almost impossible to inspire these wild bigots with confidence in us, or to persuade them that being Christians, we can be otherwise than enemies to Muslims. We have a difficult undertaking. We're trying to convince these guys we don't hate them. We're fighting you because you're terrorists, not because you're Muslims. And then it got to a point where he just didn't care anymore. And gone through so much of this, you'll find that by May 23rd, the commander-in-chief of the enemy's forces has offered for my head $6,000 and double the sum for me a prisoner, and $30 per head for Christians. Why don't he come and take it? I love the military attitude. He wants me? Come on, have a piece of me. So he was just tired of trying to convince these guys that we're good guys, we're not here to fight you because of your faith. Just had it, because this is their religious motivation. They're going to do this because this is a guarantee of salvation. This is the same, just like we're going to pray for people, part of our faith, they're going to attack as part of their faith. It's just who they are. That's what we learned back then. Now, continuing on, so for 5 years we had military troops on the ground fighting those 5 nations. Again, several of them backed out. It was Tripoli that was a real incalcitrant one that didn't want to back off. So after that point in time, 1784 to 1805, Thomas Jefferson now for 21 years has dealt with Muslim terrorists. Now, if you remember back about 6 or 8 years ago, a member of Congress was sworn into Congress, the first modern Muslim member of Congress, and his name was Keith Ellison. Keith Ellison was sworn into Congress, and he would not be sworn in on the Bible. He was sworn in on that right there. That right there, that is Thomas Jefferson's Koran. And when he was sworn in on Thomas Jefferson's Koran, he says, this proves the great influence that the Koran has had on the United States of America. Thomas Jefferson supported the Koran. He had a Koran. Now, the question becomes, why in the world would Thomas Jefferson own a Koran? And the answer was very simple. As a matter of fact, if you know anything about military history, you know that Sun Tzu says, know your enemy. 1786, these guys said, we attacked you because that's what our book says. Jefferson said, you're kidding. There's a book that says you go to heaven if you kill people. I got to see that. So Jefferson in London gets a copy of the Koran. He didn't buy the Koran because it was a great influential book that helped shape the development of America. He got that to know how the opposition thought. And so he took that Koran, and that's why he has the Koran. Now, it's interesting. It concerned a lot of people. There were a lot of editorials written at the time that we now have an open Muslim serving in Congress. That's a real concern. That, again, is not a new problem in American history. The Bible says there is nothing new under the sun, Ecclesiastes 1:9. If you go back to the founding, there's a man named John Randolph. He's from Virginia. He's a congressman from Virginia. He was elected to Congress in 1799, and he served in Congress under 6 different presidents. And he openly says, I hate Christianity, I love Islam. Every time the crescent and the star triumphs over the cross of Christ, I am elated. And so you've got an open professing guy who says, I love Islam, I hate Christianity. There you got an open, apparent Muslim serving in Congress in 1790. How did they handle that? No, it's really pretty easy. The way they handle it, and you've heard of Francis Scott Key, the Star Spangled Banner. Francis Scott Key went to John Randolph and just started a relationship with him, buddied up with him, and became friends with him, and over the course of time started sharing Christ with him, and started telling him about Christianity, and eventually Francis Scott Key converts John Randolph to Christianity. So you have the Islam guy who gets converted to Christian. So if you're concerned about Muslims in Congress, that's the best solution for it right there. Just go create a relationship and lead them to Christ, which is what Francis Scott Key did to John Randolph of Roanoke back in that point in time. So that's getting away from that. Go back to Jefferson. So for 5 years on the ground, we have military fighting going. We've stopped paying the tribute. We now have the fighting. 1805, our troops come back home. 1806, an interesting book is published in America. The book published in America is this one. I actually own this. If you remember from last year, you that were here, we own 100,000 documents from before 1812. So I have thousands of the handwritten documents of Adams and Jefferson and Madison and all these other guys. This is the first Quran ever published in America. It's the first American edition of the Quran. 1806, October 18th. Now, why did we do this? Because we just finished 5 years of fighting against people who are motivated by this book. Americans, we paid a lot for this. We lost lives in this. If you want to understand what this is all about, we've now printed the Quran so you can read it for yourself. And so on the inside, it has this 2 pages of notes to the reader. It said, this book is a long conference of God, the angels, and Muhammad. And so it goes through and tells you the background of the Quran. But what's interesting is the way it closes right over here. You see that right there? It says, reader, thou wilt wonder that such absurdities have infected the best part of the world, and will avouch that the knowledge of what is contained in this book will render that law contemptible. Once you know what the Quran says, there's no way you're going to support what's going on in the world with this religion. Once you find out that you go to heaven by killing people. So they actually published the Quran so that Americans would know what the teachings were, so they would understand why we just spent 5 years fighting, why we had lost American lives and spent American money. Now, we don't do anything like that today to teach the philosophy. You know, this is the religion of peace, and we just all got to get along, and etc. And the media does a terrible job of telling us what's in that book. But we used to print this book so that Americans could read it for themselves and make their own judgments about it. So this is part of the background of Jefferson. So after all these years, he goes out of office. The next president, 1809, is James Madison. 1809 starts off with problems with Great Britain. And within 3 years, we're at war with Great Britain, the War of 1812. Well, interestingly, the Muslims see the American Navy, the Marines are all tied up with Great Britain. We know what we can do, so they started attacking American ships again. This is where we learned the lesson: you have to be able to fight a war on 2 fronts. Because with our military all tied up with the British, we can no longer defend Americans. They're now being attacked again all over the Mediterranean. Our shipping, our commerce, our economy is being disrupted by the attacks. And so what happens is we continue the War of 1812. The War of 1812 is finished in 1815. At that point in time, in 1815, James Madison then dispatches the military back overseas to the same part of the Middle East where we've been fighting, and he sends back over with 2 military expeditions, Colonel William Bainbridge and Commodore Stephen Decatur. Decatur had been a lieutenant under Jefferson the first time. Now he's going back as a commander because he's already fought this for 5 years and a decade ago. Now he's back again. So these 2 forces go back after 2 years on the ground, running through, thumping heads again, just like we did before. They come back to the table, and by the way, it was close hand-to-hand combat. All the drawings and paintings from back then show the same kind of thing that we've had in the urban warfare that went through Mosul, went through Iraq and Afghanistan. It's just vicious warfare. And so after 2 years of that, they came back to the table, they signed a peace treaty, and that finally ended it. At that point, after 32 years, we've now kind of brought some peace because we've used enough military force to convince them that this is not in their best interest to continue to come after us. So that's what the War on Terror was, the first War on Terror. 32 years of conflict, 7 years of armed warfare. You have 4 different military expeditions that went over. Now, from that background, let me just throw this thing out. What have we learned from history? Why would Muslims continue to fight Americans, including today? Why fight Americans? Well, remember what the ambassador told Adams and Jefferson? The ambassador answers, it's founded on the laws of their prophet Muhammad. It's written in their Quran that all nations who should not acknowledge their authority were sinners, and that it was their right and duty to make war upon wherever they could be found, and that every Muslim who should be slain in battle was sure to go to paradise. That's why they fight. It's interesting that Timothy Pickering, who was a general in the American Revolution, he's the Secretary of War under both Washington and Adams. Pickering had to deal with this, and he said this. He says, taught by revelation that war with the Christians will guarantee the salvation of their souls, the Muslims' inducements to desperate fighting are very powerful. These are not easy people to defeat because this is their salvation they're fighting for. And so, understanding this philosophy, you look and say, why would they fight Americans today? And the answer is, taught by revelation that war with the Christians will guarantee the salvation of their souls, the Muslims induce them desperate fighting very powerful. Why would they attack thousands of innocent Americans in 9/11? Because taught by revelation that war with the Christians will guarantee the salvation of their souls, the Muslims induce them desperate fighting. Why would they attack the Pentagon? Because taught by revelation that, see, that's the answer. If you don't get that answer, you'll never figure out how this foreign affairs stuff works. That's the simple answer that goes there. Now, the Pentagon, this is a friend of mine, Colonel Brian Birdwell. He now serves in the Texas Senate. But on the day of 9/11, some 14 years ago, and we're not far removed from that anniversary of 9/11, 14 years ago, 9/11, he was actually in the Pentagon when it got hit. You know, the famous picture of the Pentagon, the part that collapsed there, and you can see the part that collapsed, etc. Well, Brian was there, got run over by the plane. He was covered with the jet fuel. He was set aflame. That is the office where he was working, but he had walked right across that and was returning back to his office when the plane hit. So he was actually standing right there when the plane hit and everything fell apart and his body got covered. This is about 6 minutes after the plane hit. This is taken by one of the security officers there. And you can see the hole where the plane went in. And this is the part that's about to collapse. That circle right there is Brian's window. You see all the flame coming out the window. Every one of his co-workers was just fried to a crisp. Brian was standing at the time right here. So the plane gets here, he's covered with jet fuel as it comes up. And he is taken, one of the survivors, he's the closest survivor to the point of impact. And excuse me for the next two pictures, they're not pretty, but this is Brian in the hospital where he was for literally a number of weeks and months. About 70% of his skin was gone. He had nothing left. So 39 surgeries later, he's back to himself. They put artificial ears on here because it burned his eyelids off, it burned his eyebrows off, it burned his ears off. So he now looks really normal. I mean, it's amazing what American medicine can do. But Brian is talking about what happened that day and where he was when all this happened. And Colonel Birdwell, really sharp guy, makes a great point. He said, you know, we think about 9/11 as the trigger point. And he said, the problem was it was a long time before that. And if you look at terrorist attacks about Americans, look at the 2 decades leading up to 9/11. You start with the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. Remember the attack on the U.S. And by the way, the attack on the U.S. Embassy is an attack on American soil. We own the soil every embassy is on. It's that way in the United States. The Iranian embassy, if they had one here, it would be Iranian soil. We couldn't go onto it. Canadian embassy, everybody's embassy is their own soil. That's international law, has been forever. So they came on American soil to attack Americans. 1983, the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, they attacked our embassy again, American soil, 17 dead, 100 wounded. The Marine barracks in Beirut, again, our soil, 242 dead. And just go across the years. 84, they attacked the club where the servicemen met in Torreon, Spain. 2 dead, 79 wounded. They're going after Americans. They went after Lieutenant Colonel Buckley. The embassy annex in Beirut, again, they keep attacking American property. Torreon, Spain, the Air Force Base there. TWA flight, they found an American soldier on the TWA flight, murdered him, threw him out the door. They blew up Pan Am, 180. See, just year after year, 1993, the first World Trade Center bombing. Then you have the Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia. Again, all of this is American soil, American property. U.S. Embassy in Nairobi, the U.S. Embassy in Tanzania. All this American soil is being attacked. U.S. coal in Yemen. This goes on for all these years, and then you get 9/11, 2001. Now, what happens is, in and from this region, we have now had nearly 10,000 American casualties in 2 decades. So they're taking Americans out at a great rate, killing and wounding Americans. And that's when things change, is on 9/11. I love the way that Colonel Birdwell talks about this. All of these attacks that happened in those 2 decades, all of that happened when we were on defense. We're negotiating, we're talking, we can get over this, it's going to be all right. 9/11, we finally went on offense. And when we finally decided to go on offense, the fall of the Taliban, the Afghan, and we went through it. And now that we pull out and decide we're not on offense again, here they come right back in, and we've got the same problem. Because like Adam said, we don't have the stomach for a long fight, because this is a theological fight for them. For us, it's an intellectual fight. For them, it's a theological fight. And we don't understand that, and we don't have the stomach for it. So we have now literally facilitated the murder of millions of Christians over there because we've created a vacuum. We aren't there to do what we should be doing. Going back to this region, Colonel Birdwell says this region of the country where all this has happened for centuries, he says, is very much like a swamp. Mosquitoes come out of that swamp on a regular basis. 2 things you can do. You can learn to live with the mosquitoes, or you can go in and drain the swamp. That's the only 2 options you got. And so we had lived with the mosquitoes for a long time. We finally decided that we're going to go in and drain the swamp. We're going to get rid of all this infestation that's coming out of Iran and Iraq and Syria, etc. And so that's why we put troops on the ground. That's what we did 200 years ago, was we're tired of the mosquitoes. We're going in to drain the swamp. We're going to get rid of the mosquitoes out of that swamp. Now, notice that since we went on offense, we've had thousands of lives lost, but they've not been civilian lives. They've been guys going in. And see, what we don't get on the other side is the reason that attacks against Americans overseas and at home are down is because our guys have taken out literally hundreds of thousands of their fighters. Pentagon doesn't think it's politically correct to release casualty numbers on the other side. We have decimated their ability to attack us, which is why they're now doing different things to come after us and attack us. But now that we've created a vacuum, man, we have made it really tough over there for the Christians that remain. So finishing this up, when you look at what happened with the war on terror, where we are with this issue today, and by the way, we recently finished a national poll, and in that national poll, we asked Christians, let me set this up better, that's not what happened. Christians are saying there's a cacophony of voices out there telling us how to think about all sorts of issues, about homosexual marriage. If 2 people love each other, why can't they get married? We hear all sorts of things about Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood, women's health, they do mammograms, they do all this stuff for women, and they don't do mammograms. But there's a lot of voices and all sorts of competing information out there. And so Christians particularly are saying we need some clarity for ourselves and for our kids. We need to know what the Bible says about certain issues. And with that basis, the question we had was, well, what issues do Christians want to know about? And so we commissioned a poll. George Barton, a national pollster, went to the field and asked Christians, what is it that you want clear guidance on from the Bible? What do you want to hear from your religious leaders? Clarity. What do you need clarity on? And there were 150 different issues that came back. Of those 150 issues, they then conducted a bigger poll that says, of these 150 issues, what are the issues you think are the most critical or the most vitally important for you to hear about, that you need a biblical perspective on these issues? You need church leaders to give you guidance. Well, it came back. Those who said that it is critically important or very important for me and my family to hear a biblical perspective, the top 12 issues are fascinating. Top 12, the number one issue, the number one issue is abortion. 91% of Christians said, I need to hear about abortion from church leaders because I don't necessarily know what the right information is. Number 2 issue was religious liberty and religious persecution, the kind of stuff going on with ISIS right now. And it goes all, the top 12 issues, issue number 12, 150 issues was Islam. I don't understand the stuff about Islam. There's a lot of voices. Is it a religion of peace or is it not a religion of peace? Can we negotiate them? Is it worth losing lives over? Can't we all sit down at the table and come to an agreement on this? That's the number 12 issue that Christians need guidance on because there's such a confusion of voices out there. It happens that in this